December 7th, 1944. The Hürtgen forest lay frozen under a pale winter sun, the trees stripped bare and rattling in the wind like the bones of the men who had fallen there. At the edge of the ruined village of Bergstein, a single ridge dominated the world. Hill 400. For months, it had resisted every attempt to seize it. For divisions had attacked. For divisions had failed. 20,000 soldiers had fought, and 6,000 had already been cut down by the German guns anchored into its slopes. Everyone inside the American command believed the same thing. The hill was mathematically impossible. German defenders occupied reinforced bunkers, interconnected trenches, and machine gun nests positioned like a lattice of death. No infantry force could cross that ground without being broken apart. Textbooks said you needed overwhelming numbers. Commanders said you needed armor and massed artillery. The Germans had all the advantages. And yet, in the half-light of morning, 120 Rangers from the 2nd Ranger Battalion tightened their straps and checked their last magazines. Among them, Lieutenant Leonard Lomell studied the ridge from behind the crumbling wall of a cemetery. Nothing in his training at Fort Benning had prepared him for this. An attack with no numerical advantage, no element of secrecy, and no retreat. But he saw something the doctrine never taught. The defenders were confident, predictable, expecting another slow, methodical, textbook assault. The Rangers would give them the opposite. Speed, violence of action, a strike so abrupt it would disrupt the carefully layered German fire plan before it could open. Lomell understood the risk, but he also understood the mistake thousands before him had made. They had allowed the Germans to dictate the rhythm of the battlefield. As the minute hand crept toward 0830, the Rangers rose from cover. Snowflakes drifted across their helmets. The hill loomed ahead, scarred, fortified, waiting. No one spoke. They simply moved, each man knowing the truth. Hill 400 was not just a position. It was a challenge to everything they had ever been taught about war. The first steps toward Hill 400 felt like stepping into a furnace with no flames. The German defenders had watched the village ruins all morning, and the moment the Rangers emerged from cover, the ridge erupted. Machine gun fire slashed through tree trunks. Mortar rounds punched geysers of frozen earth into the air. The defenders had been waiting months for this moment. One last American attempt, one more predictable climb toward an impregnable summit. But what they saw now was different. The Rangers didn't spread out into long, vulnerable lines. They didn't halt to return fire or set up methodical support positions. They pushed forward in tight, aggressive teams, bounding up the slope in bursts of movement that broke the enemy's timing. Every second they stayed still meant death, so stillness disappeared from the plan entirely. Lomell drove his men up the left flank, weaving through shattered firs as bullets sliced bark into the wind. The ground was steep, icy, and littered with the scars of previous failed attacks. Broken rifles, torn packs, abandoned helmets half buried in snow. Each piece of debris was a reminder of the mathematical certainty they were defying. Halfway up, the first German bunker opened with a roar, its machine gun raking a line across the slope. The Rangers didn't dig in. They didn't wait for supporting fire. A three-man team sprinted straight for the aperture, one man firing on the run while the others closed the distance. A grenade arced in, a brief flash, silence. Then the advance continued. Moments like this repeated across the hillside, a chain of tiny explosions of violence breaking the defensive rhythm that had held for so long. For the Germans, this wasn't how Americans were supposed to fight. They expected method, not momentum. They expected organization, not chaos. Yet the chaos was exactly what the Rangers relied on, controlled, violent, and constantly pushing upward before the defenders could adjust their aim or shift their reserves. As the ridge grew steeper, the air thicker with smoke and dirt, the men realized something extraordinary. Despite the odds, they were gaining ground. Inch by inch, they were approaching a summit that tens of thousands had failed to reach. The hill was no longer a monument to impossible defense. It was beginning to crack under the weight of sheer, relentless aggression. Near the top, the world narrowed into a tunnel of smoke, snow, and muzzle flashes. The crest of Hill 400 was no wider than a farmhouse roof, but controlled miles of battlefield in every direction. Whoever held this ground directed artillery, observed troop movements, and commanded the entire Hürtgen corridor. The Germans knew it. The Rangers knew it. And as they neared the bunkers at the summit, both sides understood the next minutes would decide the fate of the ridge. The final approach was a gauntlet of interlocking guns. Each bunker covered the blind spots of the others, forming a web of fire designed to grind attackers to pieces. But the Rangers had already discovered the defense's weakness: timing. The Germans fired in patterns, bursts, pauses, corrections, leaving slivers of opportunity between volleys. The Rangers pushed through these openings with an instinct that came from endless training and a knowledge that hesitation meant death. Lomell led a team toward the central bunker, the strongest position on the hilltop. Mortar fragments tore through the air around them, showering the ground with hot metal. One Ranger fell. Another dragged him behind a stump without breaking stride. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles, dissolving into cover, then rushing forward again before the gunners could adjust. At 20 yards, the bunker's machine gun locked onto them, the tracers forming a glowing chain across the snow. Lomell didn't dive for cover. He accelerated. He lunged toward the flank of the structure, pressed against its frozen concrete wall, and yanked the pin of his grenade. The explosion inside shook the ridge. The machine gun fell silent. Almost simultaneously, the right flank team stormed a second bunker using the same reckless momentum. Another grenade, another gap torn in the German defense. The summit, once a single unbroken fortress, began to split apart into isolated pockets of resistance. Within minutes, the crest transformed from impregnable strongpoint into a chaotic swirl of close-quarters fighting. Rifles firing at point-blank range, Rangers clearing trench lines one fleeting angle at a time. The Germans fought with desperate tenacity, refusing to yield even as their bunkers collapsed. But the Rangers kept pushing, driven by the knowledge that reaching the top wasn't enough. They had to hold it, and holding Hill 400 would prove far more brutal than taking it. By 10:30 hours, the Rangers stood on the summit, breathing hard, bleeding, shaken, but victorious. Snow drifted across shattered bunkers, mingling with smoke from burning timbers. For the first time in months, the American flag, stitched on tired uniforms rather than raised on a pole, stood at the highest point of Bergstein Ridge. But the Rangers barely had seconds to register what they had accomplished. Hill 400 was not a prize, it was a magnet. And now every German unit within range was converging on it. From the far tree line, the first mortar salvos screamed in. Shells hammered the crest, tearing new craters into the earth and shaking loose the walls of half-destroyed bunkers the Rangers were still inside. The men scrambled for cover, but there was none. The summit was bare, exposed on all sides, with only the broken German fortifications to shield them. Then the rifle fire began. German infantry, survivors from the hills' own shattered garrison, launched the first counterattack less than 15 minutes after losing the position. They advanced through the smoke in small, coordinated groups, firing as they moved, attempting to retake the hill before the Rangers could consolidate their defense. The Rangers responded with the same violence of action they had used on the climb. Small teams shifted laterally along the ridge, firing from crater edges and bunker ruins, refusing to let the attackers form a solid line. Ammunition was already scarce. Every round had to count, but this was only the beginning. The Germans had planned for months to defend this hill. Now they would fight with equal ferocity to reclaim it. Throughout the late morning, the attacks came in waves, sometimes 20 men, sometimes 50, sometimes more, each one supported by mortars zeroed perfectly onto the summit. Every new assault drove the Rangers back to the edge of collapse, and every time they clawed their way forward again. The hilltop became a place where minutes stretched into hours, where the Rangers could see the enemy forming their next attack as clearly as they could see the snow settling on their own sleeves. There was no retreat, no fallback position. The mission was simple: hold the crest until relieved, or until none of them were left to hold it. By midday, Hill 400 had become a brutal, circular battlefield. There was no safe direction to face, no blind side to protect. Every compass point hit another German platoon preparing to surge up the slope. The Rangers, already reduced in number, were fighting in a tightening ring, outnumbered, exhausted, and dangerously low on ammunition. Yet none of them moved from the crest. If even a single German squad broke through, the entire position would collapse. Smoke drifted low across the summit, mixing with the frozen mist and the stench of burnt timber. The ground shook with each mortar impact, the explosions carving deeper into the hill until the summit looked less like a ridge and more like a cratered moonscape. Rangers staggered between shell bursts, dragging wounded comrades into the remnants of bunkers that barely stood upright. Even inside, shards of concrete rained down like hail with every new round. Lomell moved constantly along the line, his face gray with fatigue, but his voice steady. He reassigned riflemen to machine guns, shifted grenadiers to exposed angles, and kept small clusters of men rotating positions before the constant pressure shattered their focus. Nothing about this defense resembled textbook tactics. There were no clean sectors of fire, no organized perimeter. Instead, the Rangers fought with instinct born of training, a fluid, improvisational defense where each man responded to the nearest threat with whatever weapon he had left. At one point, a German squad broke through the left flank, sprinting toward a gap between two ruined bunkers. A Ranger corporal, out of rifle ammunition, rushed them with nothing but a captured MP-40 and 2 spare magazines he had taken from fallen enemy. The sudden countercharge stunned the attackers, buying precious seconds until reinforcements sealed the breach. Again and again the pattern repeated. The Germans surged forward with fresh strength. The Rangers met them with sheer refusal to yield. Every attack came closer than the last. Every defense cost more blood. But the hill was still in American hands. And as the sun dipped behind the trees of the Hürtgen forest, the men realized what they were truly fighting for. Not the ridge, not the mission, but each other, because if any one of them broke, the entire summit would fall into enemy hands within minutes. As afternoon shadows stretched across the Hürtgen forest, the German attacks intensified. More troops filtered in from nearby positions, and soon the slopes of Hill 400 crawled with movement. Helmet silhouettes darting between trees, rifle flashes strobing through the haze. Mortars pounded the summit with such precision that the Rangers began to understand the truth. The enemy was using every advantage the hill had once given them. With each blast, the crest shrank further, forcing the men into tighter and tighter clusters. The Rangers needed artillery support, but radios crackled with static. Antennas had been shredded by shrapnel or buried under collapsed timber. When messages did get through, the coordinates came out scrambled, distorted by shock, noise, and the frantic rhythm of combat. Formal fire missions were impossible. Everything became improvisation. Shouting corrections into damaged radios, adjusting barrage patterns not with maps, but by watching where the shells landed and shifting fire by instinct. Finally, a spotter managed to establish a thin, wavering connection with the divisional artillery batteries behind Bergstein. Without hesitation, the Rangers called fire dangerously close to their own positions, sometimes within 50 yards, sometimes closer. Shells crashed into the slopes, tearing gaps into advancing German formations. The blasts were so near that dirt showered over the Rangers' helmets. Hot fragments skittered across their clothing, and shockwaves rattled their teeth. But the artillery bought time, and time was the only resource they had left. Whenever the barrage lifted, German survivors surged forward again. Rangers scrambled from cover to cover, shifting positions not because doctrine demanded it, but because standing still meant death. A machine gun team relocated 3 times in 20 minutes, carrying their weapon through explosions and rifle fire to cover blind spots in the perimeter. When one barrel overheated, they swapped it without breaking rhythm, their hands blistered and bleeding from the heat. Through it all, Lomell never stopped moving. He checked ammunition pouches, reassured wounded men, and coordinated the shifting defensive web, one frantic decision at a time. Nothing resembled the calm logic of a training field. This was survival through adaptation. Artillery called by feel, maneuvers improvised on instinct, defenses shaped moment by moment. The Germans expected the Rangers to break, but every failed assault showed them the same truth. Hill 400 had changed hands once today, and the Americans on the crest had no intention of letting it happen again. By late afternoon, Hill 400 resembled nothing living. Smoke hung so thick over the summit that the world seemed reduced to a few meters of visibility. Snow had melted into black mud streaked with blood, and every crater felt newly carved, because shells landed so frequently that nothing remained untouched for more than a few minutes. The Rangers crouched inside half-collapsed bunkers, behind shattered logs, or in shallow depressions gouged by mortars, each man holding a sliver of ground that could not be surrendered. The German counterattacks grew more desperate. Units that had not originally defended the hill poured in from neighboring sectors, climbing the slope in scattered groups, firing as they moved, shouting above the roar of artillery. They came from different angles, each time, probing for any weakness. One moment, an assault hammered the western lip of the summit. Minutes later, another surge erupted from the tree line on the opposite flank. The defenders had no chance to rest, no rhythm to predict, no safe direction to face. Each Ranger measured the battle not in hours, but in tiny distances. 5 meters of trench line held, 3 meters reclaimed after a grenade blast, a single meter forward to reach a wounded comrade, dragging himself across the frozen earth. Every foothold mattered. Every collapse in discipline could unravel the entire defense. A German squad managed to break through near the northern crest, slipping between 2 shattered bunkers where smoke concealed their approach. They rushed forward, throwing grenades and firing from the hip. 2 Rangers fell instantly, but before the attackers could widen the breach, a sergeant and a private charged them with bayonets fixed, slamming into the surprised Germans in a desperate, close-range fight that left both sides bloodied and gasping in the snow. The gap was sealed for the moment. Elsewhere, a Ranger machine gun jammed during a critical attack. Under normal conditions, the gunner would have dropped back and repaired it behind cover. But there was no cover. Instead, he tore the weapon open right where he kneeled, hands black with grease and shaking from adrenaline, rounds snapping past his helmet. By the time the Germans pushed forward again, the gun was reassembled, belt loaded, and roaring back to life. Nothing about this battle moved on a grand scale. No sweeping maneuvers, no elegant formations. Just meters, gained, lost, and reclaimed through raw will. The Rangers were shrinking, their positions thinning, their strength nearly spent. But the hill still belonged to them, and every meter they held increased the price the enemy would have to pay to take it back. As daylight faded, the summit of Hill 400 felt like the center of a storm that refused to move. Darkness did not slow the battle. It only changed its shape. Muzzle flashes became the only light on the ridge, brief, violent sparks that revealed silhouettes lunging through smoke and swirling snow. The Rangers were no longer fighting in clean lines or planned sectors. They were defending small pockets of shattered ground with whatever strength remained in their hands, their voices hoarse from shouting warnings through the chaos. Ammunition was nearly gone. Many Rangers carried only a handful of rounds in their pockets, rationing each shot with the grim precision of men who understood that every bullet now held the weight of survival. Those who had none scavenged from fallen comrades, friend and enemy both, stripping rifles and belts in seconds before returning to the fray. Grenades became priceless. Machine guns sputtered on nearly empty belts. Even captured German weapons were pressed into service, their unfamiliar weight adding another layer of urgency to an already desperate fight. The Germans sensed the shift. They pushed harder, attacking with the knowledge that the Rangers were isolated, cut off from reinforcement, surrounded on every side. They advanced low and fast, using the growing darkness to mask their approach, slipping between trees and boulders until they were nearly on top of the defenders before opening fire. At times, the fighting on the crest blurred into a single continuous brawl. Rifle stocks swinging, knives flashing, men wrestling in the snow where tracer fire couldn't reach. Still, the Rangers adapted. Small groups rotated positions whenever possible, shifting to fresh angles or relieving comrades who could no longer hold their rifles steady. Those barely able to stand dragged ammunition crates or carried messages across the summit. Medics worked in freezing wind with numb hands, patching wounds by feel more than sight. No one spoke of retreat. No one looked toward the valley for rescue. The hilltop itself had become the only world that mattered. In the midst of it all, Lomell realized something fundamental. The Germans were attacking with numbers and momentum, but without coordination. Their fury lacked direction. Every wave they launched dispersed on the summit like water striking stone. As long as the Rangers held even the smallest fragment of cohesion, the hill would remain theirs. But cohesion was fragile. Strength was fading. And night was only beginning. The question hanging over every man on that ridge was not whether the next attack would come. It was whether they still had enough left to meet it. Night consumed Hill 400 without mercy. The temperature dropped sharply, freezing blood into dark crusts on uniforms and turning every breath into a plume of ice. Visibility shrank to arm's length. Sound became the only warning. Boots scraping rock, whispered German commands drifting up the slope, the dull clatter of rifles being readied in the dark. The Rangers tightened their circle on the summit, aware that the next hours would be the most dangerous of all. With darkness hiding movement, the Germans shifted tactics. They no longer attacked in broad formations. Instead, they advanced in small, silent teams, climbing the hill's steep sides with practiced stealth. More than once, a Ranger only realized the enemy was within meters when he saw the faint silhouette of a helmet against the sky. Shots were fired at such close range that muzzle flashes briefly illuminated faces, mud-streaked, wide-eyed, exhausted, before darkness swallowed everything again. Communication became nearly impossible. Radios were unreliable, voices carried too far, and visibility was gone. Rangers passed information hand to hand. A tap on the shoulder, a whispered direction, a shove toward a collapsing flank. Each man defended a patch of ground he could barely see, relying on instinct and the dim outline of familiar shapes to avoid shooting his own comrades. Every shadow felt like an enemy. Every movement triggered a surge of adrenaline. The Germans probed constantly. A few men here, a few there, testing, feeling for weak points. Twice, they managed to slip between positions, reaching the interior of the Ranger perimeter. Both times, the resulting fights were savage and silent, ending only when the defenders pulled together fast enough to overwhelm the intruders. One Ranger tackled a German soldier who had crawled within arm's reach, rolling with him across the frozen earth until another Ranger ended the struggle with a single close-range shot. Exhaustion hit like a physical weight. Men struggled to keep their eyes open, swaying on their feet after hours of unbroken combat. Some fought in a fog of half-awareness, pulled back to reality only by the crack of a rifle or a sharp command. Others forced themselves awake by pressing cold steel against their faces or biting down on their lips until they tasted blood. Yet for all the enemy's attempts, the line held. Every attack lost momentum once it reached the crest, where the Rangers, clinging to the hill with sheer refusal to break, countered with sudden bursts of violence. The Germans expected the defenders to collapse at any moment, but the Rangers fought like men who had decided that dawn, not reinforcement, not rescue, was the only goal worth surviving for. And dawn still felt impossibly far away. As the night dragged on, the toll became impossible to ignore. The Rangers were no longer a full battalion. They were fragments of men clinging to positions with hands and knees frozen stiff, faces smeared with mud and soot, and eyes that had seen more death than most soldiers encounter in a year. Every breath burned their lungs in the cold air. Every movement sent shooting pain through muscles already raw from hours of exertion. Yet there was no pause, no time to rest. Hill 400 demanded vigilance. The Germans increased their intensity, sending successive waves that collided with the Rangers' positions in a deadly rhythm. Artillery, mortars, and rifle fire turned the summit into a hell's cape where shadows moved, vanished, and reappeared in a dizzying blur. Each new attack stripped away the last reserves of strength. The Rangers had nothing left but determination, training, and the unshakable bond with their comrades beside them. At one point, a series of mortar shells collapsed part of a defensive trench, burying 2 men under frozen earth. Another Ranger risked crawling into the debris under continuous fire to drag them out, ignoring the danger for the sake of survival and cohesion. This instinct, this refusal to abandon any man, became the defining feature of the battle. Every injured Ranger pulled to safety, every exposed position reinforced, every gap closed instantly. These small acts were the difference between holding the hill and losing it entirely. The enemy's persistence was relentless. They hurled themselves forward with desperate courage, driven by the knowledge that reclaiming the ridge was critical to stabilizing their front. Yet the Rangers, despite being outnumbered, outlasted them, leveraging terrain, rubble, and improvisation. Every bunker repurposed as a defensive nest, every crater used as cover, every scrap of debris became part of a living, breathing network designed to break assaults before they could gather momentum. By early morning, the crest of Hill 400 was a testament to endurance rather than triumph. The Rangers were battered, exhausted, and diminished, yet the enemy had not claimed a single meter. The hill, once an impregnable fortress, remained in American hands. The impossible had been accomplished, but only through pain, improvisation, and an unwavering refusal to yield. The dawn that approached carried with it the promise of relief, but the memory of the night's unbroken struggle would define every man who survived. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the Hürtgen forest, the fighting on Hill 400 finally began to ease. The Germans, exhausted by relentless assaults and frustrated by the unyielding defense, pulled back into the trees, their forces diminished and disorganized. Silence descended over the summit, broken only by the moan of wounded men and the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. The air was thick with smoke, mud, blood, and the acrid scent of spent ammunition. The Rangers emerged from their positions cautiously, scanning the horizon for lingering threats. Survivors counted heads, patched wounds, and redistributed what little ammunition remained. Their numbers were drastically reduced. Many men had fallen, others were injured beyond movement, but Hill 400 still belonged to them. The hill slopes, once dominated by the enemy, were now littered with the remnants of countless assaults, craters, shattered bunkers, and the lifeless forms of German and American soldiers alike. Lomell walked the ridge, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion. He checked positions, encouraged those still standing, and silently acknowledged the courage of every man who had made it through the night. Every decision, every movement, every act of daring, storming bunkers, sealing breaches, calling artillery by instinct, had shaped the impossible into reality. The hill had been seized with skill, grit, and ingenuity. It had been held by determination, discipline, and sheer force of will. When reinforcements finally arrived from the 2nd Battalion, they were met with a scene that would stay in their memory forever. The surviving Rangers, still crouched in cratered positions, were physically spent but unbroken. Hill 400 had been won, not because of numbers or doctrine, but because a small, cohesive unit understood the principles of speed, aggression, and adaptability better than the larger forces that had failed before them. The battle became a defining example in U.S. Army training. Hill 400 was studied in classrooms and field exercises for decades, a lesson in how properly trained, highly motivated small units could achieve objectives that larger formations could not. The principles forged that day, rapid assault, coordinated defensive improvisation, and tactical flexibility under fire, reshaped Ranger doctrine and influenced small unit tactics across the Army. Though the Hill was quiet now, the cost was etched in every scarred face and frozen mound of earth. The story of Hill 400 was a story of resilience and tactical genius, a testament to what human courage and ingenuity could achieve against overwhelming odds. The story of Hill 400 did not end with the battle. Its lessons echoed through every Ranger classroom, every tactical exercise, and every operation where a small, highly trained unit faced impossible odds. The actions of Lomell and his men became a case study in how discipline, aggression, and quick decision-making could override numerical disadvantage. It was no longer simply a story of courage. It became a blueprint for small unit warfare. Hill 400 demonstrated that terrain alone could not dictate the outcome of battle. The Germans had advantages in fortifications, numbers, and artillery, yet the Rangers exploited speed, coordination, and adaptability to neutralize them. Every assault, every counterattack, and every improvised defensive maneuver contributed to a new understanding of what a small, cohesive unit could achieve. The fight showed that initiative and creativity on the battlefield often mattered more than rigid adherence to doctrine or overwhelming force. In the decades that followed, U.S. Army Ranger training incorporated these principles into its core curriculum. Techniques pioneered on Hill 400: rapid bounding attacks, aggressive forward defense, close coordination with indirect fire, and decentralized command decision-making became standard practice. Platoons were taught to operate independently yet cohesively, to improvise under pressure, and to exploit fleeting opportunities before the enemy could react. The battle transformed theoretical tactics into tested, actionable methods that would save lives and win engagements in conflicts around the globe. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion carried the memory of Hill 400 with them for the rest of their lives. Survivors often recalled not just the horror, but the intensity of camaraderie, the clarity of focus in the chaos, and the unspoken understanding that every man's effort mattered. The battle forged not only soldiers but legends, men whose actions redefined what was possible in warfare. Hill 400 became more than a hill. It became a symbol that courage, ingenuity, and relentless determination can defy the odds, that small units can achieve what larger formations cannot, and that in war, as in life, those who act decisively and adapt quickly can change the course of events forever. The legacy of Hill 400 endures in every Ranger who climbs a ridge, clears a bunker, or stands in the face of impossible odds, carrying forward the lessons learned on that frozen December morning in Germany.